2013, the Truth and Reconciliation event took place in Vancouver. It was taking place across the entire country, and it was bringing together residential school survivors who were telling their stories for the first time. As well, we had the historic Walk for Reconciliation in Vancouver, and that brought together over 70,000 Vancouverites in the pouring rain who all committed to advancing reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. It was historic. And reconciliation, though it wasn't a new term at that time, had started to take on new meaning. Because the country was awakening. It was realizing that it had been blind to Indigenous peoples, our histories, our perspectives. And we were deciding as a society that we didn't want to be blind anymore. This is what time was like when I started at the City of Vancouver as their first Aboriginal planner, and then as their first Indigenous Relations Manager in the City Manager's office. It was really clear to us here in the city that Vancouver was in many ways showing us that they were ready to embrace reconciliation and also ready to confront its colonial natures. And there was an openness and willingness to do things differently, even though nobody knew what that was actually going to be like. We were in a state where we were building the airplane as we were flying it, and we were making everything up as we were going along. When I started, few staff knew that these were Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh lands. Many assumed that the Indigenous community was in the downtown east side, which happens to be one of North America's poorest neighborhoods. And while we have a significant number of First Nations people who live in the downtown east side, it is not the Indigenous community in Vancouver. It's not my community, that's not my friend's community, it's not my family's community. But because the stereotypes against Indigenous peoples had run so deep, that was where people's minds first took them to a place of darkness, of abuse, and definitely not a place where creativity and aspirations can happen. And this showed me how deep this work had to go. And in order to rebuild visibility, connectivity, and belonging, the city had to confront how much of Indigenous knowledge it had erased. And these lands hold a millennia of history. These are archival maps pulled from the City of Vancouver's website, and these show us that there were a significant number of ancestral neighborhoods and village sites, trade routes, celebration grounds, places for hunting, places for coming together, places for commerce. But colonization had forced this knowledge underground, almost erasing it. So when we talk about urban planning and the shape and purpose of our cities, where do these ancestral ties to the land and water fit in? Because when we're talking about Vancouver, Canada, North America, all of these lands contained Indigenous occupation, village sites, and because colonization was so harsh, so much of this has been erased all over. So in 2013, we in the city had declared that a year of reconciliation, and it was such a successful year that we realized we had to continue the momentum. We couldn't just end reconciliation after a year of trying. That would have been crazy. So we developed what we called the City of Reconciliation Framework. And it was a city-wide policy that required every department to understand what reconciliation meant for their work plans, how it could be reflected in their budgets, and how work for advancing reconciliation could take place in the engineering department, in business and licensing, in the Parks Board. And the City of Reconciliation Framework contained 3 pillars. The first one, cultural competency, which speaks a lot for itself, required people to understand the history of these lands, to understand whose lands these were, and to understand the impacts of the Indian residential schools. The second pillar was strengthening relationship, which again is very straightforward. Building relationships with the local First Nations, having a government-to-government relationship with Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, ensuring that chief and council sit with mayor and council, and then we had a staff-to-staff relationship as well. But it was the third pillar, which was the one that I feel mattered the most, because it's why Vancouver was so successful in advancing reconciliation. A priority which continues to this day. And it allowed us to take thoughtful risks, to do things differently, to challenge the status quo, and make exceptions to normal processes while still aligning to city priorities. For the first time, the city had to make exceptions to its own rules and had permission to do so, and to choose reconciliation over routine. And we are about to be tested on what this commitment looked like. At the same time, Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh were coming together, forming family units, and forming the MST Development Corporation. They were buying back their own lands, lands that had been stolen from them, buying them back at fair market value, and using this to build an economy on their own terms. One of the sites that they had purchased is called the Heatherlands, which is about 15 minutes south of downtown Vancouver. And on that land contained a Grade A heritage building. It was the first RCMP headquarters in the province. And Vancouver's heritage policy was treated as something sacred. It was not to be toyed with. It was definitely not to be broken. And according to the policy, it meant that Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh would need to preserve this building, BC's first RCMP headquarters, and spend millions to maintain the very structure that was tied to their own oppression. And for those of you who are unaware of the history of the RCMP, one of their first jobs was to ensure that families would not be allowed to prevent their children from being stolen and taken away to Indian residential school. And so RCMP were dispatched to First Nations communities all across the country, arresting parents and grandparents. And now the descendants of those families were being told that they had to preserve this building at their own expense. And MST had felt like, well, these are our own unceded lands. And after so much colonization, they're finally given an opportunity to enter into a new phase whereby they would be active participants in the Vancouver development economy. And we did see that heritage planners at the City of Vancouver were sympathetic, but this was policy. And it became clear that this was our first big test of the City of Reconciliation framework. We had brought MST leaders together, RCMP officials, heritage experts, residents, and planners together to talk about what were we going to do with this Grade A heritage building, the first RCMP headquarters in the province. Were we going to keep it? Were we going to move it? Or were we going to dismantle it? And we learned that a lot of those options came at a significant cost. So in the end, the city decided to make an exception, that they would step aside and they would allow the First Nations, and I say that with a hint of annoyance, the city would allow the nations to remove this building. If Vancouver was serious about reconciliation, it had to confront its colonial past and present and take a risk to change this trajectory. Today, this site is going to become the home to a new cultural center, a place where we can celebrate who we are and who we want to become. Yes. This is an image from some of the work that I have done in collecting stories from knowledge keepers from the Three Nations. And we do this to learn about the history of these lands and how we can build it into the design and the programming for new buildings. And what we are learning is that there are so many histories and stories about these lands. What we also know is that urban planning and design is responsible for erasing so much of this identity and so much of this history. And Vancouver is very much a beautiful city. It's a city that we are proud of, that we're happy to celebrate. It's also known as a city of glass. And what's interesting is that it's become so gentrified and so polished that now we're finding no one is actually reflected here anymore. We could be any place. How do we change that? We have so much here to work with, and we are changing things. So when we talk about decolonizing cities, planning and design, it's about creating space for uncertainty. It's about creating space for us to go against the status quo. And I know that can make a lot of people very uncomfortable because it means you're being forced to do something that maybe you're not good at. And we like doing things that we're good at. It gives us that sense of mastery. But we also need to get used to that feeling of a gray area, an area where we're not entirely sure what the next step is, a part of the process where things can go wrong, and they probably will go wrong. And I will say that in the work that I do, things go wrong a lot. But that doesn't mean that we stop. It means that we take an opportunity to learn and pivot and to bring more folks together. Because a big part of this work is bringing in the voices of Indigenous communities that had largely been excluded so that we could bring in all of this vibrancy, all of this culture. And in the projects that I work on, we ask ourselves a really important question. Are our projects advancing colonization? Right? Are you erasing the identities from these lands further? Or is there an opportunity to contribute to healing? And that's where the real work begins. Because Indigenous life in the city is resilient, it has that grit that makes urban life so exciting. It's full of humor, it's full of beauty, it's full of energy. And to go back to that gray area where we don't know what the next step is going to be, we actually create space to reimagine. We create an opportunity to integrate even more color. And I feel like it's a risk worth taking. Thank you.